The wind keened across the battlements of Dragonstone, rattling the ancient windows in their frames and flinging salt spray high over the walls. Darkness pressed in all around, and the halls were lit by guttering torches that threatened to go out at the faintest whisper of air. Deep in the keep, Rhaegar Targaryen stood alone in the chamber of the painted table, eyes fixed on the swirling lines that mapped out the 7 kingdoms he had once sought to unite. Moonlight slanted in through the arrow-slit windows, illuminating flecks of dust that hovered in the stillness. The painted table had once been his domain of contemplation, a vast surface depicting Westeros in painstaking detail. It was here the princes and kings of House Targaryen had planned their conquests and defended their realms for generations. But for Rhaegar, the table offered neither comfort nor clarity that night. Long had he believed in prophecy and destiny. Long had he tried to shape events so that some calamity might be averted. The more time passed, the more he understood that the lines between prophecy and doom were as thin as a sword's edge. He let his hand drift along the ridges of the table's coastlines, brushing over the miniature painted mountains near Dorne, letting his fingertips hover over the stylized shape of King's Landing. In his mind's eye, he saw battles fought and lost, alliances shattered, and a new kind of threat that no mortal lord or lady had ever fully comprehended. The others, the White Walkers, those who dwelled in the far north, beyond the wall, in the realms of eternal ice and snow. Those that so many in the south believed were myths, or at best, shadows from stories older than the first men. His heart was heavy with knowledge he had not entirely asked for. Few knew that in the twilight of his life, what the bards called the last year of Rhaegar Targaryen, he had not merely been studying the histories of great kings or reading songs about Azor Ahai in the Red Keep's libraries. He had reached beyond the cracks of the world to glimpse horrors best left unseen. There had been nights when he dreamt of walking in a white desert under a black sky. He had heard faint whispers of ice, felt spectral hands reaching for him across a gulf of centuries. At times, it felt as though something beyond the wall was calling to him, summoning him as if he held a key to their freedom. He closed his eyes, remembering the day he had slipped away from the royal retinue. Many believed Rhaegar's greatest acts of stealth had been in the pursuit of love, his visits to Lyanna Stark, the hush of secrecy at the Tower of Joy. But the greatest secret journey he had ever undertaken was one that none alive, except perhaps a few that were half-mad themselves, suspected: a solitary voyage north. He had told no one, not Elia Martell, not Arthur Dayne, not even Prince Lewin Martell of the Kingsguard. This was his burden to carry alone, for if he failed, no one would know how or why the kingdom would face its doom. In that hush of Dragonstone's painted table chamber, the memory washed over him, haunting and unbidden. He recalled the pounding of his heart the night he abandoned the comfort of the royal tent near Moat Cailin, riding north without a sigil, his armor hidden under a plain cloak. Disguised as a common knight, he had slipped beyond the gift, beyond the Shadow Tower, forging a path onto the haunted forest trails that even the Night's Watch seldom dared to tread. All the while, the nights grew longer, colder. The breath that left his lips on those rides was thick with mist, and the black trees around him seemed to brood with ancient malice. He remembered reaching Craster's Keep, though he did not tarry there. The old man's eyes were suspicious. Rumors placed him in contact with the darkest of powers. It was a rumor Rhaegar half believed, for he had never met a man more quietly vicious than Craster. So Rhaegar pressed on alone, further and further into the wild. How many days he rode, he could scarcely recall. Snow and stinging wind battered him, and a constant dread gnawed at his spirit, as though each step deeper into the wilderness threatened to unravel his sanity. It was there, in the heart of the frozen trackless wastes, he first felt the presence that had haunted his dreams. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every stirring of the wind, carried a dire sense of purpose, as if the land itself was trying to tell him something. Desperation was what drove him forward. Desperation to protect the realm, to fulfill what he believed was his father's undone duty. No, not King Aerys's duty, for the Mad King had foregone any sense of duty long ago, consumed by paranoia and cruelty. Rhaegar meant the duty of House Targaryen itself, the duty to stand against the darkness, the duty that might have begun with Aegon the Conqueror or even earlier. He had read enough about the long night and the prince that was promised. Perhaps the truth was more nuanced, but Rhaegar believed that if the darkness was coming again, he might hold the power to forestall it, or at least to gather the knowledge that would be needed when the time came. He had not expected to make direct contact with the others, and yet, on a frigid night that offered neither star nor moon, the quiet swirl of snow parted, and the breathless hush of the wood turned malignant. An unnatural cold pressed in, so profound that it felt like a blade against his exposed skin. In the dancing gloom, he saw them, slender silhouettes with flesh like milky ice, eyes burning the color of pale blue fire. He remembered the sound the snow made beneath their feet, not a crunch but a soft hiss that his mind interpreted as an unholy language. Their presence was alien in every sense of the word, ethereal, indifferent, and ancient. His fear was a living thing, pulsing in his ears, urging him to turn his horse and flee. And yet he did not run. Some greater compulsion, that sense of destiny or madness, compelled him to stay. His gloved hand froze where it gripped the hilt of his sword. He believed in the visions, in the prophecy, in the notion that all his life had been leading him to a confrontation with something far larger than mortal strife. So he remained, breath ragged in the silent cold. The others did not rush upon him with swords of ice. They merely stared, an unblinking alien regard that seemed to size him up and assess whether he was prey or something else. He took a step forward, forcing his hand to release the sword's hilt. He came unarmed to them, chest tight with mortal terror. And he spoke, in the hush of the forest that smelled of pine and hoarfrost. He found himself whispering a vow, a promise, a plea. He recalled little of the actual words, only that he felt something slipping from him, an intangible offering from his soul. A presence pressed into his thoughts, a voice like the scraping of ice on stone. Whichever vow he made, whichever oath parted his lips, he had the harrowing sense it was accepted. When the others vanished, melting back into the shadows of the swirling wind, Rhaegar collapsed in the snow. His lungs burned with every breath of that piercing air, and tears froze on his cheeks. He had not realized he was weeping until later, when he lit a small fire in a sheltered hollow of trees and huddled against his horse for warmth. Some unholy transaction had taken place, a silent exchange that left him half delirious. With trembling hands, he tried to recall the final words he had spoken, but they danced just out of his mind's reach, as though the memory was already being stolen away. He had fled south soon after, half frozen, wrestling with a sense of guilt and a flicker of hope. What had he gained from that confrontation? A dream that the White Walkers would remain slumbering for a time? The sense that if the realm were threatened, he could somehow intervene? Or was it something more sinister? Had he bargained for a respite, only to assure that, in time, an even greater doom would fall upon the land? Rhaegar opened his eyes to the present, to the painted table of Dragonstone. He felt the thick hush of the fortress around him, a hush that echoed with the howling wind outside. He did not know if this secret was truly his alone. Perhaps there were other keepers, the children of the forest, the greenseers, the old gods themselves. But if the threat was real, if the others were stirring, then the respite he had sought was coming to its end. The realm would be tested as it had never been tested before, and he could only hope that the living would rise to the challenge. He felt a chill settle upon his spine. Distantly, in the halls of memory, he recalled how so many knights and lords had scoffed at the idea that the others still existed. They believed the Wall and the Night's Watch were merely a relic of an earlier age, a living museum. Yet the illusions men held about safety were as fragile as glass. Rhaegar could feel it in his very bones. His own bargain, however ephemeral, was wearing thin. He drifted from the painted table, footsteps echoing in the corridor. Outside the tall windows that gazed on the roiling sea, the night was almost impenetrable. Shrouded in darkness, the waves heaved and battered the rocky shores. He passed men who barely recognized him. He was but a wraith in his own halls. Word had it that he was dead after all. The world believed he had perished on the Trident at the hands of Robert Baratheon. Many claimed they had seen the waters swirl red as rubies when the fabled rubies on Rhaegar's breastplate flew free under the hammer's blow. Only a small handful in his confidence knew the truth, that the body found in the shallows was not his. Yet that truth was no comfort if it meant living in the shadow of a greater dread. He made his way to his private chambers, a place seldom disturbed. A single brazier glowed with a low red light, offering scarce warmth against the chill that pervaded the fortress. Rhaegar eased himself into a carved chair near the hearth and stared at the flickering coals, longing to dispel the memory of that impossible, ice-laden clearing. Had he truly believed he could strike a deal with inhuman forces? Or was it the prophecy that had driven him, the prophecy that demanded an heir born in the line of the dragon to stand against the cold darkness? He thought of Elia, of her gentle wisdom and the memory of her laugh. He thought of Lyanna Stark, wild and resolute, who had seemed so woven into the tapestry of his fate. These were the ties of mortal life that made him cling to hope. And yet, he had stepped beyond mortal bounds when he confronted the others. He had sought their ear or their mercy, or perhaps only their understanding. What they had granted him in that barren place no man could guess. But Rhaegar had felt the vow thrumming in his blood ever since. A muffled knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. A young steward slipped inside, face pale. "My prince," the steward said, though there was uncertainty in his tone, as if he wasn't entirely sure he should address a man believed to be long dead as prince. "You asked to be informed if the winds shifted. The sentinel outside has reported the sky is clearing, and a raven just arrived. It bears news." Rhaegar rose. The steward approached, placing a sealed scroll into his hands. The wax was black, unadorned. Rhaegar broke it and scanned the contents, his eyes narrow. Word from a contact in the far north, perhaps from the few who might still serve the old secrets. The letter was cryptic, bearing only a short phrase. "The winds of winter have begun to blow. Winter's heralds stir again. The vow can no longer hold them back." Rhaegar read and reread those words. Something inside him clenched with a gnawing fear that threatened to devour his composure. It was an omen, surely. The last phrase seared itself into his mind. He dimly nodded at the steward, who bowed and left, uncertain as to the letter's meaning. Alone in the dim chamber, Rhaegar sank to his knees before the brazier, the parchment still clutched in his hand. The vow can no longer hold them back. He had suspected as much, but to see it confirmed made a tide of dread swirl through him. In the gloom, he buried his face in his hands. He had already lost nearly everything once: his crown, his father, his mother, Elia, and the children. He had even lost the reputation he once cherished. The realm believed him dead, a fallen prince whose foolishness had sparked Robert's rebellion. And perhaps that was not entirely wrong. His choices had led him here, to the cusp of a new age where the old nightmares walked again. If the respite was over, then everything was about to change. The others would not negotiate a second time. The realm would pay the price Rhaegar had never fully understood when he had knelt in the snow and offered them whatever it was that had parted from his soul. He swallowed hard, gazing into the flicker of embers. He had to warn someone, had to ensure that if the others truly rose, the living would stand united against them. Yet how could a ghost return to court? How could he stride into King's Landing and proclaim the doom he himself might have unwittingly unleashed? Could he reveal that his father had been mad beyond measure, and that Rhaegar had made his own mad attempt to safeguard the future, but that it had proven a flimsy shield at best? The brazier's red glow deepened, and in that moment he had a vision. Not a waking dream, but something close. He saw the silhouette of a monstrous figure of ice, crowned with horns of frost, brandishing a sword that gleamed like moonlit glass. He heard the howling of a bitter wind, the clash of steel, screams swallowed by 1,000 snowdrifts, and a monstrous horde of wights marching south under a dead sun. And amid the chaos, a single sword of flame, Lightbringer, if the old tales were true, held aloft by a warrior whose face he could not quite see. Then the vision ended, leaving only a sense of foreboding. He rose and left the chamber, moving down the corridors with a new sense of purpose. He did not plan to remain idle in the gloom of Dragonstone. If he was indeed the catalyst that had lifted the seal on these ancient horrors, then he would do all in his power to rally defenses and warn those who might still stand a chance. The Crownlands may no longer be his. The Baratheons and the Lannisters and even the Starks might see him as a traitor or a memory that needed to remain buried. But for the sake of the living, for the sake of his children, those living and those lost, he would muster the courage to stand in the breach. He summoned a half-dozen loyal retainers, men and women who had served House Targaryen without question even in exile. Most were older, veterans of the Blackfire Pretender rebellions or lesser conflicts. All were seasoned in the art of secrecy. He told them to ready horses and a ship, to gather supplies for a journey that might well take them north of the Neck. Some stared at him in disbelief. Others nodded solemnly, no doubt recalling the cautionary tales about the prince's obsession with prophecy. But none questioned his command, not outright. Through the rest of that night, Rhaegar moved like a restless spirit, ensuring the keep was provisioned and that certain key items traveled with him. Among them was an old warhorn rumored to have been found in the crypts beneath Summerhall after the tragedy. Its origin was unknown, and it bore ancient markings that defied easy translation. He also carried old texts about the Long Night, about the Dragon Lord's earliest forays to Westeros. And he took a sword, a simple, unadorned steel blade. Valyrian steel would have been ideal, but the only such sword in his possession, he had once bequeathed to Ser Arthur Dayne. Dawn was not Valyrian steel in truth, yet it possessed a power of its own, and it was lost to him now. Before dawn touched the sky, Rhaegar stood at Dragonstone's harbor, the cold wind lashing at his silver-blonde hair. A single ship awaited, sails furled, anchored in the black water that heaved against the docks. Lantern light flickered across wet timbers. His retainers moved in near silence, stowing casks, crates, and saddlebags. A stable boy led the horses aboard with careful steps, mindful of the uneasy animals who snorted at the rocking of the ship. Rhaegar boarded last. As the vessel pushed away from the harbor, he gazed up at the looming shape of Dragonstone, perched upon its volcanic foundation. It glowered like a fortress of dragons carved by sorcery. Something about it felt accusatory, as though it whispered to him, "You are the last hope, or the last folly." He could not decide which. The sails were hoisted, and the ship gathered speed under a strong wind blowing west across Blackwater Bay. The sky grew lighter, unveiling a bleak, overcast dawn. It felt as though the entire world existed in twilight, and Rhaegar's heart lurched as he wondered. If the others rose in earnest, how many dawns would remain? As the journey commenced, the days blurred. The narrow waters of Blackwater Bay gave way to the open sea, and then back to the winding coasts near Crackclaw Point, Maidenpool, and the edges of the Cape of Eagles. They avoided major ports, well aware that Rhaegar's face might still be recognized by some. Though he had been presumed dead, his features had been notable silver-gold hair and the regal bearing of old Valyria. He wore a hood and maintained a discreet profile, but he could not help the pang of longing for a time when he walked openly as a prince. That era was long past. Now he traveled in secret, a traveler in the guise of a nameless lord, with a small retinue who claimed to be sellswords and merchants ferrying goods north. At night, he read by the flicker of a single lamp, poring over volumes and scrolls in a cramped cabin that smelled of brine and pitch. He studied the fragments of prophecy, references to the last hero, to the Night's King, to the forging of Lightbringer. Again and again, he revisited the memory of his lone confrontation in the haunted forest. Had he indeed made a vow that would keep them at bay for a generation? And if so, what had he promised them as the cost of that détente? The text offered no easy answers. Scholars wrote in riddles, and the ancient accounts contradicted one another. Perhaps it was not a matter of what, but whom he had promised. The thought struck him with an icy dread late one night. The prophecy surrounding the prince that was promised spoke of a child of Aerys' lineage, a child of fire who would combat the forces of ice. Could it be that in his desperation to ensure the others did not rise prematurely, he had given them a pledge that the hero who might stand against them would not be born until too late, or that the champion would be compromised? His head ached. He forced himself to remain calm, to breathe slowly. He did not truly know the details of his oath. It was as if the memory was shrouded in fog, a gift or curse of those ice-eyed beings. Perhaps that was their cunning, to seal bargains in half-forgotten dreams, ensuring that men unwittingly delivered the means of their own ruin. He kept to himself, speaking little on the voyage. Even the crew gave him a wide berth, as if sensing that to disturb his deep silence would bring a restless spirit down upon them. The ship made its way up the coast, stopping briefly for water and fresh supplies, always at out-of-the-way coves or small fishing villages where no one asked too many questions. Finally, they slipped past White Harbor under cover of a stormy night, heading for the Bight with the intention of finding a secret landing near the desolate shores. From there, Rhaegar planned to go by land, to move north through the Wolfswood or perhaps take Hidden Row. Tez around it, whichever was safest and least likely to draw attention. Word had likely reached Winterfell of unusual travelers. The north was not so easily traversed without alerting the local lords, but Rhaegar's retainers knew ways of disguise, and coin still opened many doors or closed many mouths. Yet even as they neared those colder waters, Rhaegar felt a growing tightness in his chest. The wintry gloom seemed heavier here, the skies perpetually gray, and the winds ever colder. He could almost sense the presence he had felt once in that haunted forest. It lingered at the edge of his consciousness, like a voice calling from the far distance. Each night, as the frigid breeze swept across the deck of the ship, he would stand at the railing, his cloak drawn tight, watching the dark horizon. Sometimes snow fell, dusting the sails. His breath plumed in the air, a reminder of how near the cold was now. He tried to quell his trembling, tried to focus on the possible allies he might find. Would House Stark heed him if he revealed himself? Or would they blame him for the abduction of Lyanna, for the war that claimed so many northern lives? Would they see him as a harbinger of tragedy, or a broken man with little left to lose? He thought, too, of the Night's Watch. Perhaps that would be the best place to go first. The Watch served no king, and if he came to them in secrecy, perhaps they would at least hear him out. They alone had the ancient charge to guard the realms of men from what lay beyond the wall. But the Watch had fallen into disrepair over the centuries, diminished in numbers and reputation. Even so, it might be the only institution in Westeros that still remembered the truth of the long night. At length, the day came to disembark. A pale dawn greeted them as the ship slipped into an icy inlet, surrounded by jagged rocks and thin, scraggly trees bent by relentless winds. Snow drifted down from a leaden sky. Rhaegar's retainers lowered the ramp, leading the horses ashore with care. The animals whickered anxiously, their breath misting in the cold. Rhaegar followed, stepping onto wet sand that crunched with frost. He gazed inland, seeing only the bleak line of the forest and the low hills beyond. They set up a makeshift camp a short distance from the shore, lighting a small fire from driftwood. Around it, Rhaegar convened the small company, men and women with stern faces, each loyal to him beyond question. He spoke quietly, explaining that from here, they would travel north under assumed identities. They would skirt major towns, avoid the high roads, and rely on contacts who still might be sympathetic to the Targaryen cause, or at least who were not entirely allied with the current regime. Their ultimate goal was the Wall. One or two of his companions shot each other uneasy glances. None asked outright why they would risk such a journey, but Rhaegar suspected rumors circulated among them. Rumors of White Walkers, living dead, and an unholy vow. They rode at dawn each day, pressing deeper into the north. The landscape was harsh, the terrain rugged. Weeks passed in a blur of numb hands and silent nights around small campfires. They rarely dared to light large fires, fearful of attracting unwanted attention, be it from wildlings, loyal bannermen of the new king, or bandits. Winter was creeping across the land, each day a little colder, each night a little longer. Sometimes, Rhaegar thought he glimpsed a figure at the edge of the tree-line, pale eyes watching, but whenever he looked again, there was nothing but twisted shadows. In quiet moments, he pressed a hand to his chest, as if to feel the vow that lay over his heart. It felt heavier each day, as though the others were awakening, pulling at him. He could still remember the final words of that raven scroll. The vow can no longer hold them back. Would he see them again as he had all those years ago, in that lonely clearing? He felt a perverse curiosity, tinged with dread, at the thought of standing face to face with those icy specters once more. One dusky evening, their group sought refuge in a half-collapsed barn not far from a small hamlet. The walls provided at least a modicum of shelter against the bitter wind. A single lantern lit the interior, revealing old straw and cobwebs. As the retainers dozed, wrapped in cloaks, Rhaegar sat near the lantern, reading from an ancient text he had brought. An untranslated volume reputedly from the library at the Citadel, filled with references to the last time the others had appeared in force. He turned a page, squinting at the weathered script. The text spoke of bargains made in the Age of Heroes, alliances so vile men refused to speak of them aloud. One line caught his eye. Some said the Night's King took an other to wife, forging a pact that defiled both realms. Another rumor. The long night ended only when humans broke these unspeakable pacts, paying in blood. Bargains with the others always demanded a price, the text insisted, and that price was never small. Rhaegar's stomach twisted. He found himself thinking of his own children. Aegon, who might have been the savior the prophecy demanded. Rhaenys beloved daughter, so clever and kind. Lyanna's son, hidden away, his fate uncertain. He closed his eyes and offered a silent prayer that the price was not tied to them. To think that, in a moment of desperation, he might have doomed them. Guilt racked him so fiercely that he let the book fall to his lap. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, trying to push away the black thoughts. A faint rustling at the barn door made him look up. One of his retainers, a wiry man named Corlys Waters, stood there with an uneasy look. "My prince," the man said quietly. "There's something out there. I heard footsteps, or perhaps hooves. Not quite sure. Could be travelers or it could be bandits." Rhaegar set the text aside and rose to his feet. He took his sword belt and donned it. Corlys led him outside, into the stinging cold. The night was dark, clouds obscuring the moon. Rhaegar strained his ears, but heard only the whistling wind. Then, a soft crunch, footfalls on snow. He motioned for Corlys to remain still. Slowly, Rhaegar circled around the side of the barn, keenly aware of how exposed they were in that open yard. When he peered beyond the weathered corner of the barn, his breath caught. A faint movement in the gloom, pale shapes, sliding through the darkness, so quiet that they seemed unreal. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He pulled back quickly, heart hammering in his chest. Not men, not beasts. The flicker of eyes that glowed with ghostly light. There were two, maybe three. Could they be whites, or others themselves? He felt that old terror seizing him again. The same primal dread that had nearly broken him years ago. "Stay here," he whispered to Corlys, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Wake the others, quietly. If they attack, use fire. Steel alone won't do much if they're what I suspect." He steadied himself, forcing slow breaths. He stepped around the corner again, sword in hand, though he knew that if they were truly others, a plain steel sword was next to useless. The shapes advanced, sinuous movements that made them seem to float rather than walk. Snow swirled about their ankles. Then, from the darkness, emerged a single figure at the forefront, tall and impossibly graceful, with eyes like chips of blue comet fire. The being made no sound, but Rhaegar felt a sudden crushing sensation in his mind, as if the air had turned to solid ice. He could barely move. He wanted to speak, to say something that might recall the vow, but his voice caught in his throat. He heard the faint ring of steel as Corlys or another companion readied weapons. A second figure circled to his left, keeping an eerie silence. The cold was so intense that Rhaegar's fingers burned where they gripped the pommel of his sword. Then the lead figure raised a hand, and Rhaegar's vision swam. For a heartbeat, he saw not the barn nor the bleak farmland, but a vast domain of ice, and at its center, a fortress of twisted, glimmering spires. He saw an army of white shadows, thousands upon thousands. At their head stood a crowned figure made of frost, pale and ageless. And Rhaegar felt a presence press into his thoughts. The vow has ended. The time has come. He nearly collapsed, the image so potent it made his stomach churn. The night returned, the barn in front of him, the others mere paces away. Corlys exhaled a ragged breath behind him. Rhaegar forced out the only words he could manage. In a voice strained with fear, "Wait, our bargain." The lead other cocked its head, a gesture almost curious. Its eyes flared in an unearthly glow. Rhaegar felt the weight of ages pressing upon him, as though he were an insect pinned under glass. Then, without warning, the figure stepped back. A swirl of snow enveloped it, and it vanished into the darkness. The others followed, silent as a gust of wind. The cold presence withdrew, and Rhaegar stumbled forward a step, his knees nearly buckling. His breath tore from him in desperate gulps. Corlys was at his side in an instant. "7 hells. What in the name of?" "They've come to remind me," Rhaegar said, voice hoarse. "Our time is nearly up." He did not elaborate, but the despair in his tone made Corlys' face pale. Soon, the rest of the camp was awake, clustering around Rhaegar. They had glimpsed the silent, gliding shapes fading into the night. A hush lay over them, thick with dread. Finally, a woman named Rhaelyn, once a washerwoman in the Red Keep who had followed Rhaegar out of unwavering loyalty, spoke in a trembling whisper, "My prince, what do we do now?" Rhaegar looked at her. The question burned in his mind. He recalled the vision, the fortress of ice, the legion of white shadows. The vow has ended. The time has come. No matter what he had tried to do all those years ago, it had simply delayed an inevitable onslaught. They would come and come soon, and the realm was not prepared. Yet in that swirling darkness, a flicker of resolve awakened in him. He would not simply bow to despair. "We ride for the wall," he said, his words clear. "We must warn them, all of them. The realm must unite, or we die. I would see the Night's Watch, see the Starks. Whomever will listen." He saw the fear in their eyes, but also a new determination. For better or worse, they were bound to him. They readied themselves with solemn efficiency. By the time the first pale hint of dawn brushed the sky, they were on the road again. Ahead lay the ancient seat of House Stark, and beyond that, the wall. Rhaegar could only hope that the living would set aside their quarrels and heed the warning. He prayed that the realm still had time, that an unlooked-for champion might arise, that his own sins would not doom them all. Because if the others had truly awakened, if the dreadful bargain was undone, then winter had arrived in earnest. And even a prince who had once believed himself the chosen savior might be powerless to avert the storm he had unleashed. They kept to the hidden paths of the north, always wary of both human threats and the preternatural menace that haunted Rhaegar's thoughts. Each morning, they woke in cold tents or ramshackle shelters, their muscles stiff, their eyes gritty from lack of sleep. Each day, they forced themselves onward. Rhaegar guided the small column with an urgency that gave them little rest, but none dared protest. They had all seen the pale shapes outside the barn. Their prince's grim determination seemed the only shield they possessed. In the dim hush of twilight, they rode through tangled forests where the branches clutched at their cloaks like skeletal hands. Crows cawed overhead, and the horses stamped nervously at the slightest rustle in the undergrowth. The north in winter was a place of silent dread. Every gust of wind through the tall pines felt like a whisper from the old gods. Days blurred into weeks. The slow approach to Winterfell took far longer than it would have in warmer seasons. Deep drifts of snow made each league a trial. They lost one horse to a misstep in a frozen marsh, and another came up lame. At times they passed small northern villages, solitary clusters of stout log homes with thick roofs of thatch or wooden shingles, but Rhaegar and his companions kept away. In some places, at night, they could see the distant lights in the windows and smell peat fires or roasting meat carried on the wind. The temptation to seek warmth or a real bed was strong, but caution prevailed. Rhaegar believed that in order to speak to Eddard Stark or to the Night's Watch, He must not be hindered by local lords or bounty hunters. A Targaryen prince with silver-gold hair was too easily recognized, especially one widely believed to be dead. Still, they needed supplies. One day, not far from the outskirts of a half-frozen lake, they came upon a single traveler leading a sled piled with pelts. The traveler, an older woman with a face as weathered as old leather, startled upon seeing their armed band appear from the trees. Rhaegar stayed back, letting Corlys Waters do the talking. With some silver, they procured a small portion of her furs and dried meat. The woman appeared too wise, or perhaps too accustomed to harsh times, to press them with questions. She only offered a word of caution about rumors from the far north. When Corlys coaxed out more details, she shrugged. Hunters vanish in the mountains. Rangers from the Watch don't come back. Like always, or maybe worse than always, wolves are bolder. People say they see shapes in the snow at night. She shivered, as though haunted by her own words. This is the North. We've all heard such tales. But this time, it feels different. Corlys thanked her and returned to Rhaegar with the supplies. They resumed the journey, none daring to voice what they all thought. The stories were no mere tales this time, not when they themselves had glimpsed horrors in the night. By the time the looming walls of Winterfell finally came into sight, half buried in snow, many of their horses were exhausted and some in the company suffered from frostbite. They perched on a wooded rise, gazing at the stronghold in the distance. Despite the gray gloom of the overcast sky, Winterfell's thick granite walls and towers projected a sense of steadfast resilience. Smoke rose from numerous chimneys within the castle, and beyond the walls, they could see the outlines of the vast Winterfell godswood. To the east lay the small town that served the castle, with scattered houses and shops. Around the entire complex, gently rolling fields were turned white under winter's approach. They huddled amidst the trees, discussing options in low voices. Rhaegar had removed the hood of his heavy wool cloak, letting the icy breeze stir his silver hair. Lines of fatigue scored his face, and a gauntness had set in, making him appear older than his years. He rested a hand on his sword hilt, thoughtful. If we march right to the castle gate with our arms and our story, they'll think us mad, Corlys said quietly. Or worse, enemies. Rhaegar nodded. We must tread carefully. But if House Stark will hear me, I must speak to Lord Eddard. He alone might recall enough of the old tales, or might be honorable enough to listen, before dismissing me as a pretender. The memory of Lyanna flickered through his mind. She had been of the wolf's blood, fierce and passionate. She had trusted her eldest brother in all things. Rhaegar hoped that Eddard was the man the realm believed him to be, just, loyal, and tempered by compassion. If ever he needed a lord's courtesy, it was now. A burly man named Dallin, once a sworn sword to House Targaryen, cleared his throat. We can't just walk up to them in broad daylight. Even if they don't attack us, word might spread before we can speak to Stark privately. We should wait until dusk. Perhaps only a few of us approach. Rhaegar looked at the fortress again. The notion of sneaking into Winterfell reminded him uneasily of the subterfuge he had employed in King's Landing during his father's descent into madness. Secrets upon secrets, a spider's web of hidden truths. But it was the best chance they had. We'll approach in the evening, he agreed. Most of you remain hidden outside, near the woods by the stream. I'll bring one or two of you with me to vouch for my identity. He paused, glancing around the circle of tired faces. If I do not return, or if something goes awry, you must try another path to reach the wall and warn the Watch. A hush fell. Nobody liked talk of betrayal or capture, but the risk was real. The threat overshadowing them all was far greater than any single misfortune. They made a makeshift camp deeper in the grove, out of sight of any patrols. Afternoon slid into evening. The temperature plummeted again, the wind picking up a keening note that whistled through the pines. In that hour, Rhaegar prepared. He hid the more damning trappings of his identity. A few Targaryen signet rings, a scrap of cloth once embroidered with the three-headed dragon. He kept only his sword and a small token he had once worn around his neck. A pendant shaped like a dragon's head, dull with age. At last, accompanied by Corlys Waters and a middle-aged retainer named Bryn, Rhaegar took a final steadying breath. The three of them emerged from the tree line. Dusk settled over the land, painting the sky in sullen shades of gray and indigo. Lamps flickered along Winterfell's walls. They skirted the main road, following a winding path that led to the northeastern gate, a smaller entrance typically used by huntsmen and foresters. A single guard in a fur-trimmed cloak stood sentry, stamping his feet to ward off the cold. He seemed startled to see travelers at such an hour. "Who goes there?" the guard called, stepping forward with his spear angled. Rhaegar lifted his hands, palms open. "Travelers seeking Lord Stark's hospitality." His voice was calm, but in the darkness, the guard might not note the subtle tension in his stance. "You're late to be on the roads, and these are dangerous times," the guard said warily. "State your names and your business." Corlys spoke quickly, weaving a half-truth. "I am Corlys, a merchant out of White Harbor. My companions and I have come with news from the south, in hopes of a meeting with Lord Stark. We bear no ill will." The guard's eyes flicked to Rhaegar, taking in the man's noble posture and the fine sword at his hip. Suspicion furrowed his brow, but he must have weighed that turning away unexpected guests might anger his lord. At length he nodded sharply. "You'll come with me. I'll take you to the guard sergeant. He'll decide if you can wait in the courtyard until the steward can speak with you." A second guard emerged from the shadows, alerted by the conversation. Together, they escorted the three newcomers through the gatehouse tunnel, past a raised portcullis. The courtyard within was not large. This was a secondary enclosure, near the stables and storage barns. Half a dozen men walked the grounds, tending to chores or patrolling. The guard spoke low to a taller figure wearing the Stark direwolf on his surcoat, who then eyed the visitors with practiced scrutiny. "Travelers from White Harbor, you say? The roads are foul this time of year." The sergeant's voice was brisk. "We'll fetch the steward. Perhaps Lord Stark will see you tomorrow." Rhaegar said nothing, merely offering a polite nod. He could almost taste the tension on his tongue. They were led to a corner of the courtyard and told to wait. A stable lantern cast long shadows over the trampled snow, the air tinged with the familiar smell of horses and wood smoke. Bryn and Corlys tried tea. All maintained an easy stance, but Rhaegar noticed the subtle shift in their eyes, tracking every movement of the Winterfell guards. After a short while, the steward arrived, a lean man with a neatly trimmed beard and a harried look. He regarded them with caution, but seemed willing to let them speak. Rhaegar cleared his throat, carefully choosing his words. "We bear news of great importance from the south. Please, we request an audience with Lord Stark. It concerns matters beyond petty politics." The steward frowned but said, "Lord Stark is at table presently, and he does not hold audiences so late without cause. Tell me the nature of your business. I'll decide if it merits disturbing him." Rhaegar exchanged a glance with Corlys. Neither wanted to speak openly in the courtyard, but they had no choice. Rhaegar took a half-step forward, lowering his voice. "It is about a threat that stirs north of the wall. We have reason to believe the others are active again." The steward's face contorted, half disbelief, half alarm. He blurted a scoff. "The others? You've lost your wits. You come here with campfire stories." Corlys lifted a hand in a placating gesture. "We do not peddle tales. Our word is sincere. This is an urgent matter of life and death for all the North, and perhaps the realm. If Lord Stark would spare us but a quarter hour, we can explain." The steward's lips pressed in a thin line. He glanced at the guards as though to gauge their reaction. They looked equally perplexed. Finally, he sighed. "I'll relay the message to Lord Stark. You'll remain here under watch." He turned on his heel, striding away, cloak flapping in the cold wind. Minutes dragged by. Rhaegar felt every heartbeat pound against his ribs. He was certain that Eddard Stark might dismiss them or, worse, imprison them if he suspected treachery. Time stretched, and each breath of frigid air seemed sharper than the last. At length, the steward returned with a half-dozen armed men behind him. "Lord Stark has agreed to see you," he said in a carefully neutral tone. "Follow me, and do not attempt any mischief. Your weapons stay sheathed. Do you understand?" Rhaegar inclined his head. "We understand." The Watchers led them around to one of the inner gates, through a corridor that opened into the larger courtyard that fronted the Great Keep. Here, the snows had been shoveled aside in neat banks. More men patrolled, bows slung across their backs or spears in hand. Beyond the courtyard, they saw the main doors of the Great Hall, where faint music and light spilled out. The steward guided them around, not into the main doors, but through a side entrance that led into a passage with walls of ancient stone. Warmth hit them at once, the heavy air of a place that boasted hot springs beneath its foundations. Torches sputtered, throwing shadows across the corridor. Footsteps echoed off the stone as they descended a short flight of stairs and then traversed a narrow hall. At last, they arrived at a pair of doors guarded by two men wearing the direwolf sigil. The steward murmured a word, and the guards stood aside, opening the doors onto a smaller audience chamber. In the days of the kings in the north, such a room might have served for private judgments. Tapestries adorned the walls, scenes of battles past, the direwolf of House Stark in prominent display. A great hearth blazed at one end, bathing the chamber in dancing firelight. There, near a carved chair of old oak, stood Eddard Stark. He wore a simple tunic of gray, trimmed with fur, and a long sword belted at his waist. His dark hair framed a face both solemn and weary, though young lines still showed about his eyes. A few courtiers hovered at a respectful distance, uneasy. As Rhaegar and his companions entered, Stark's gaze flicked over them with piercing intensity. "My steward tells me you bring urgent news about unnatural threats," Stark said, his voice low. "He also mentioned you insisted on seeing me personally. I do not often humor travelers telling ghost stories. Speak truly and quickly. Who are you, and what is your purpose here?" Rhaegar stepped forward. In that moment, the temptation to fling off his hood and declare himself a Targaryen prince warred with caution. The risk was enormous. He bowed stiffly, heart pounding. "My lord, I thank you for granting us this audience. My name is Rhaegar." A breath. "I understand how strange this must sound, but I urge you to hear me out. We have reason to believe that the White Walkers, the others of ancient legend, are stirring beyond the wall. I have seen them myself with my own eyes. The danger is real." Stark's frown deepened. A flicker of disbelief danced over his features, yet he did not order them seized. Instead, he measured Rhaegar with a steady stare, as though searching for truth in his bearing or voice. "You say you are Rhaegar," he repeated slowly. "A common name in the south, perhaps. You claim you have seen these others. How?" Rhaegar drew a breath. If he were to tell the story properly, it would demand revealing more of himself than he cared to in front of so many watchers. Yet he saw no other path. He inclined his head. "My lord, would you grant me a private word? There are parts of my tale that must remain discreet. I mean no offense to your men, but it concerns old wounds and the fate of the realm." Unease rippled through the chamber. Stark's courtiers looked to their lord, alarmed that a stranger would request such seclusion. But Eddard Stark took a measured moment, then gestured for the courtiers to withdraw. "Leave us," he said quietly. When they hesitated, he added, "I will be safe. There are guards without, and I am not without skill in arms." Reluctantly, the others filed out, leaving only Rhaegar and his two companions, plus the steward and one older guard near the door. Eddard Stark's expression told them plainly that if they tried anything, swift retribution would follow. "Speak your piece," he said, crossing his arms. "Convince me this is not a waste of my time, or a ploy to bring trouble to Winterfell." Rhaegar's throat felt dry. "My lord Stark," he began, "I swear by the old gods and the new, this is no trick. I have spent years in obscurity, presumed dead. But I was once known as Rhaegar Targaryen." The name hung in the air like a drawn blade. The guard stiffened. The steward's eyes went wide. Eddard Stark's hand drifted to the hilt of his sword, though he did not draw. "A vile jest," he said softly. "Rhaegar Targaryen died on the trident." Rhaegar raised his chin. "So the realm believes. Yet I stand before you now." The tension thickened until it was nearly suffocating. Eddard Stark's eyes narrowed to slits. "If this is some scheme, you look somewhat like the man I saw at Harrenhal all those years ago." His gaze flicked over Rhaegar's features, the silver hair now dulled with road dust, the pale Targaryen complexion, the angled face. "But that cannot be. The man I knew is long dead." Rhaegar's voice caught, remembering the day he crowned Lyanna Stark as the Queen of Love and Beauty at Harrenhal. All the rumors that had followed, all the regrets. "My lord, I know it's difficult to believe, but in these times we cannot cling to illusions that might cost us our lives. I regret much of what has passed. The war, the bloodshed, I bear my share of blame. But I did not die on the trident. I was spared, though the realm was led to believe otherwise. Perhaps you do not care for how I survived, only that I have, and I come now not to claim a throne, but to give warning. The others are real, and their awakening is near." The old guard near the door shifted, a glimmer of fear in his eyes. Eddard Stark exhaled, struggling to reconcile what he heard. "So you say, if you are indeed Rhaegar Targaryen, why would I trust you?" "Because once I loved your sister," Rhaegar said simply, voice trembling. "Because the realm is in danger unlike any it has faced in 1,000 years. And because I believe you to be an honorable man who will not abandon the North to a threat that could swallow us all." At the mention of Lyanna, Stark's eyes flickered with raw pain. His jaw tightened. Moments passed in strained silence. Finally, he spoke, voice hushed. "What proof do you have?" Rhaegar hesitated, then reached into the collar of his tunic and withdrew the small pendant he wore. He passed it to Eddard. "Lyanna gave me this ring from her own hand. I shaped it into a pendant to keep it safe and close. She told me it bore the mark of House Stark, a tiny direwolf sigil inside. Examine it closely, and you will see." Frowning, Eddard took the pendant. He held it close to the firelight, squinting. Then Rhaegar saw the subtle shift in his expression, recognition giving way to an inward recoil of emotion. He returned the pendant. "This was hers," he said heavily. "But that does not absolve you of the suffering your actions caused." Rhaegar closed his eyes, nodding. "I know, and I do not come to beg forgiveness for the war. I only come to prevent a disaster that will make mortal conflicts pale." Stark moved to the side of the hearth, staring into the flames as though they might offer guidance. "Let us say I believe you are who you claim," he said after a moment. "Let us even say I believe you truly saw the others. I have heard rumors from the Watch, though they remain unconfirmed. Rangers vanish, wildlings whisper of dead things in the woods. But the Watch is weak, and rumor alone does not prove the White Walkers have returned. Why, then, come to me?" Rhaegar stepped nearer, the firelight glimmering off the lines of his face. "Because you are Warden of the North, and your forebears built this keep. Because if the others are active, the first place they will strike is beyond the wall, and the North must rally the realm to face them. I know men have grown complacent, believing the others are but ancient tales. I also know I hold little credibility. Even if King Robert were to learn I lived, he would see me as an enemy. But you, Lord Stark, your voice carries weight with the Night's Watch, with your bannermen, and perhaps even at court. If you speak of the threat, men will listen more readily than if I alone do it." Stark studied him, searching for any sign of deceit. Finally, he nodded once, a reluctant acceptance. "So you wish me to raise the alarm to my bannermen, to ride to the wall and see this threat for myself?" "Yes," Rhaegar replied softly. "Come with me to the Watch. Let us speak to them. Let us confirm the truth. And if I am wrong, if it is only rumor, then I shall trouble you no more. But if I am right, the realm will need every sword, every alliance we can muster." A long pause followed. Stark's guarded demeanor flickered, revealing the burden he carried as lord. "I will not commit my people to war on a rumor," he said, "but nor will I ignore the possibility of doom. If the White Walkers do stir, that concerns all of Westeros, and I cannot stand idly by." He straightened. "I will ride to the wall. I will see what the Lord Commander says. But I cannot simply vanish. I am Lord here with a wife and responsibilities." Rhaegar understood instantly. Lyanna had died in childbirth, leaving Eddard to raise the boy, though the realm believed that child to be Eddard's bastard. Rhaegar's own heart twisted at the thought, for that child was also his, a living piece of Lyanna. He could not speak of it now, he dared not, but the knowledge lingered like a presence in the room. "I do not ask you to forsake your duties, only to send ravens to gather men you trust. Let them guard Winterfell in your absence," Rhaegar said carefully. "Time may be short, but I know it is not so simple as walking away." Stark stared at him for another long moment, as though reading the lines of his face for sincerity. Finally, he exhaled, turning to address the steward. "See that these men are given quarters for the night, under guard but not as prisoners. Let no word of their identity spread." He looked to the older guard by the door. "Double the watch on them. If anything about their story proves false, or if they attempt to flee, alert me at once." Then to Rhaegar he added, "Tomorrow we will speak more. For now I must think, and I must discuss matters with my lady." Rhaegar inclined his head. "Thank you, my lord." The steward gestured, leading Rhaegar, Corlys, and Brynn back into the corridor. A subdued hush fell over them. Rhaegar's heart hammered with an odd mixture of relief and dread. He had not been cast into a dungeon, nor had he been turned away outright. But he could see the wariness in Stark's eyes, the painful memory of Lyanna that must burn behind every question. There was no easy path to trust here, but at least a door had cracked open. The steward took them to a small suite of chambers near the guest quarters, though these were more austere. 2 guards stationed themselves outside the door as the steward lit a few candles in the main room, gesturing to the modest pallet beds within. "You may rest here. Food will be brought. Keep to yourselves, 'cause no trouble. If you attempt to leave, you will be stopped." "Understood." Corlys and Brynn murmured assent. Rhaegar thanked the steward quietly. When they were alone, Brynn let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging. "It could have gone worse." "It still might," Corlys muttered, pacing. "He might wake tomorrow with a change of heart and toss us in irons." Rhaegar sank onto one of the pallet beds, the straw mattress rustling. He felt utterly spent. "It is a risk," he allowed, "but Stark is an honorable man. He will weigh truth against suspicion. For now, we've done all we can. Let us hope the morning brings clarity." They ate the simple meal of bread, onions, and a bit of salted pork that a servant delivered. Then they settled in for a fitful night's rest. Rhaegar lay awake in the dark, thinking of how close he was to his own child, Jon, who the realm believed was Eddard's bastard, not a Targaryen. He yearned to ask after him, to see him, but it was too precarious. Another wave of guilt washed over him. If the others were truly rising, all the lineage secrets in the world might mean nothing if the living could not stand united. At last, exhaustion overcame him. He dreamed of swirling snow, of a sword of pale ice raised in a skeletal hand. He dreamed of a great weirwood tree with carved eyes weeping blood, and of a faint voice whispering in the wind. The price must be paid. He woke at dawn, heart pounding, the taste of cold ashes on his tongue. His 2 companions also stirred, both looking drawn. A knock came at the door, and a servant entered with steaming porridge. "My Lord Stark will see you after breakfast," she said with a timid glance. "I am to bring you to the small hall." They ate in silence, nerves on edge. When they finished, the servant returned and led them through the dim corridors. Winterfell's walls seemed to hum with quiet life. Servants stoking fires, maids carrying linens, stable boys hustling back and forth. None seemed to pay them much mind, though a few looked curious. They reached the small hall, a chamber more intimate than the grand great hall. A single trestle table stood near the hearth. Eddard Stark sat at the head, with a young woman to his left, her hair auburn, her posture poised but wary. Catelyn Tully, Rhaegar realized. Beside her was a maester with gray robes and chain. Several guards lingered near the walls, hands at their sword hilts. Eddard motioned for Rhaegar to sit on a bench across from them. Corlys and Brynn remained standing behind him. The tension in the room was a palpable thing. Stark spoke quietly. "I have considered your words. I find it difficult to reconcile the idea that Rhaegar Targaryen, presumed dead on the Trident, has appeared at Winterfell to warn me of an ancient threat. But I also recall that my brother Brandon once said you were not the man people believed you to be. He met you briefly years ago, and though he harbored anger over what happened with Lyanna, he admitted you had a certain gravity." Rhaegar bowed his head. "I am sorry for everything that befell your family, but we cannot change the past. Only face the future." Catelyn Tully studied Rhaegar with unconcealed suspicion, her hands folded on the table. "If the White Walkers truly threaten the realm, why have you come to Winterfell first? Why not ride straight for King's Landing? Robert Baratheon is king. Do you not think the entire realm must be rallied?" Rhaegar lifted his gaze to hers. "The realm does need to be rallied. But if I rode into King's Landing proclaiming myself Rhaegar Targaryen, I would be executed or locked in the Red Keep's deepest cell before I could speak a single word. Robert's hatred for my family is well known. Do you think he would hear me out?" She considered that, lips thinning. "Perhaps not." Eddard rested a hand on hers. "My lady, we must decide how best to proceed. I mean to ride to the wall to speak with the Lord Commander. If there is any truth to these rumors, the Night's Watch will know more. They have scouts in the haunted forest. If the signs are real, we must gather forces. If not, we may put this all to rest." Catelyn's eyes flicked between them. "You would ride away in winter, leaving Winterfell behind at such short notice?" Stark's gaze softened. "I will take a small party and be gone only as long as needful. Roose Bolton is due to arrive soon to deliver taxes owed. The Manderleys have pledged men if needed. You will have enough at hand to maintain order. I have no wish to be gone from you for long, but this matter, something in my gut tells me I cannot ignore it." He turned to Rhaegar, steel creeping back into his voice. "I will ride north. You will show me whatever proof you claim to have. You will also keep the peace. One hint of betrayal, and I will end you myself, ancient threat or no." Rhaegar inclined his head. "I accept." By midday, the courtyard was alive with motion. Stark had assembled a small retinue, 24 men, including knights, archers, and a handful of seasoned guards. They gathered supplies, horses, and sledges for the journey north. Rhaegar watched from the sidelines, wearing a borrowed cloak of heavy gray wool, his sword belted at his waist. Snow drifted down in lazy flakes, and the gloom of approaching winter pressed around them. Catelyn stood on the steps, her expression tight with concern. Beside her, a dark-haired boy peered from behind her skirts, young Robb Stark, curious about the bustle of armed men. Rhaegar had to quell the ache in his chest at the sight of children safe in their home while his own children. He shook the thought aside and focused on the imminent journey. Eddard approached. "We ride at once. Our path will take us through the Barrowlands and up the King's Road past the Gift. The roads are not good, but we must make haste. You and your men will stay close to me. Do you understand?" Rhaegar nodded. "Yes, my lord." He beckoned Corlys and Brynn, who had been quietly loading the horses. Both looked uneasy at the idea of traveling so closely alongside men who might become their jailers if fortune turned. But they respected Rhaegar's decision. He had confided in them that this was the surest path to reaching the wall with Stark's blessing rather than his enmity. They rode out that very hour. Winterfell's gates yawned open, and a thin line of riders passed through, cloaks flapping in the wind. The standard-bearers carried the gray direwolf banner, though the cloth hung limp in the frigid air. Rhaegar rode near the front, flanked by Stark and his guards. Seldom had he felt such a strange mix of dread and hope. The suspicion radiating from the Northmen was palpable, if he so much as twitched in a suspicious manner, they would be upon him. Still, he reminded himself, this is the only way. If the Lord of Winterfell came to believe, truly believe, that the others were stirring, it would be the first step in uniting the realm. And they needed unity above all else. For if winter's horrors crossed the wall, no single kingdom could stand alone. They made steady progress through the snowy fields around Winterfell, crossing the frozen streams that wound through the land. As the day dimmed, they reached the edges of a thick forest. The lead scouts found a spot for a camp near a half-frozen pond. Fires were lit, tents pitched. Stark set watches around the perimeter. Rhaegar and his two companions found themselves sharing a fire with some of the Stark soldiers, whose eyes flickered with curiosity and mistrust. Silence weighed on them for a time, broken only by the crackling of the flames. Finally, one soldier said, "You speak of others as though they truly walk. My grandsire used to scare us with tales of the long night. Said the others had pale skin and blue eyes like ice. Is that what you saw?" Rhaegar nodded solemnly, carefully choosing his words. "Yes, they are silent, and their presence brings a cold beyond any winter. I faced them once, in the deep forest north of the wall years ago." Some of the soldiers looked at him askance. He could almost hear the skepticism in their minds. Another soldier spat into the fire. "Things north of the wall are always monstrous. Wildlings, ice, beasts, but a man's eyes can play tricks in the snow. Or maybe they are real after all and we're all doomed." He grinned humorlessly, but the flicker of doubt in his expression gave him away. Corlys cleared his throat. "We should all pray we never see them, but if we do, best we stand together. Fire is said to help, and dragonglass, obsidian, He glanced at Rhaegar, recalling snatches from old stories or superstitions. Rhaegar nodded in confirmation. The men shifted uneasily. Eventually, they all bedded down. Rhaegar lay staring at the starlit sky, half hidden by drifting clouds. The hush of the forest around them reminded him of the night he had first seen those pale shapes. He doubted he would sleep, fear nibbling at the corners of his mind. But exhaustion claimed him eventually, giving him fleeting dreams of hoarfrost and distant whispers. Days slipped by in a similar fashion. They rode from dawn to dusk, making slow but steady headway along the King's Road, which was rutted and partially iced over. They passed the barrows from which the Bar Rollins took their name, mounds rising from the snow like ancient ghosts. Rhaegar reflected on the age of this land, how many millennia of battles and kings it had seen. The deeper they traveled into the north, the more he felt the watchful presence of old powers, as though the very stones of the earth remembered the last time the others walked. They encountered few travelers on the road, though sometimes they glimpsed distant farmsteads. They made brief stops at holdfasts that owed fealty to House Stark, where Eddard's name and presence secured them shelter for a night. Rhaegar kept his head low and said little, letting Stark speak for the group. Rumors of what truly lay behind their journey did not spread, or if they did, men wrote them off as foolish gossip. In the evenings, after camp was made, Stark occasionally conversed with Rhaegar in a subdued tone. Their discussions remained tense, shaped by mutual caution, but they spoke of the long night, the age of heroes, and the fragments of knowledge each had gleaned. Stark admitted that the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch had reported increased wildling activity, but no definitive proof of the others. Rhaegar, in turn, shared bits of prophecy he had studied, how the last long night was ended by the first members of the Night's Watch, aided by the children of the forest. The Great War had been all but erased by time, but echoes of it remained in old songs. One twilight, as the wind rattled the bare branches overhead, Rhaegar found himself speaking more frankly than he intended. "There is a prophecy. I have chased it all my life. It spoke of the prince that was promised, one who would stand against the darkness. I believed it to be me once, then I believed it to be my son. Perhaps it's neither. Perhaps the prophecy is simply a tale told to keep hope alive. But I know the threat is real, prophecy or not." Stark's voice was quiet, thoughtful. "My sister, Lyanna, she believed in you. She told me in secret that not all your family was like the Mad King. But the war changed everything. A crown of blue roses could not stop the tide of blood." His face closed off, memory twisting in him. Rhaegar's chest tightened. "I failed her. I failed many. But perhaps I can help save others from a worse fate." Stark nodded, though there was a flicker of sorrow in his eyes. They spoke no more that night. Their party continued north until they passed the last river and approached the lands known as the Gift, belonging to the Night's Watch. Snow fell incessantly now, slowing their progress. Forest loomed on either side of the road, and the wind howled through the high, frozen boughs. Soldiers wrapped themselves in furs, cursing the biting cold. Rhaegar felt a grim sense of anticipation. He remembered how, in the far distance, the wall was like a vast white line across the horizon, daunting and impossible. When at last they crested a rise and caught sight of the wall's immensity, many in the company drew a sharp breath. Even though they had all likely seen it before, the spectacle was humbling. A colossal barrier of ice, stretching east to west, disappearing into the gloom of the horizon. It towered over the land, blotting out part of the pale sky. Closer still, one could make out the ramparts atop it and the hints of structures at its base. Castle Black lay near the center of the wall. Smoke rose from its chimneys, and faint lights glimmered amid the snowdrifts. Stark's company urged their horses forward, hearts pounding with renewed urgency. When they reached the outskirts of the castle, black-clad men of the Watch came forth to meet them. They appeared as grim silhouettes in the swirling snow, armed but not hostile once they recognized the Stark banners. Eddard dismounted, gesturing for Rhaegar and the others to do the same. One of the watchmen, a stoop-shouldered ranger with a gray-flecked beard, stepped forward. "My Lord Stark, an unexpected honor. We did not know to expect you." Stark's breath misted the air. "We came on urgent business, Master Ranger. I would speak with Lord Commander Corgyle at once, if he is in the castle." "Aye, my lord. He's here. This way." They led the party inside the walls of Castle Black, where the courtyard bustled with black brothers shoveling snow, caring for ravens, or mending fences. Near the massive switchback stairs leading to the top of the wall, Rhaegar saw groups of men returning from ranging, their faces drawn and hollow. He thought he glimpsed a flicker of dread among them. Perhaps they had encountered something in the wilderness. Stark and a handful of his men followed the ranger into the Lord Commander's tower. Rhaegar, Corlys, and Brynn went too. The others tended to the horses and set up temporary lodgings in the barracks the Watch provided. The interior of the tower was chilly, the stone walls sweating from the temperature difference near the eternal ice. They ascended a narrow stairwell and arrived at a chamber where a great table stood, strewn with maps and reports. Lanterns flickered, casting dancing shadows across the clutter. Lord Commander Corgyle was a tall, balding Dornishman with keen eyes and a stern countenance. He wore a black cloak with modest silver fastenings. He greeted Eddard Stark with respect, though he showed only mild surprise at such an unannounced visit. "My lord, I welcome you to Castle Black, though I suspect these are not times for courtesy calls." Stark inclined his head. "You suspect right. We come seeking answers. Your rangers have reported strange happenings. Men disappearing. I would hear what you know." Corgyle's gaze flicked to Rhaegar for an instant, curiosity brimming. "We have indeed lost more rangers than usual. Wildlings speak of dead things in the woods, but wildlings say many things. Still, the frequency of vanishings troubles me. I've sent out parties to investigate, but they return with no solid proof. Merely tales of empty villages, strange tracks in the snow. It grows worse the farther north one goes." Rhaegar stepped forward, his heart thudding. "Lord Commander, my name is Rhaegar. Years ago, I traveled beyond the wall and encountered a being, an other or White Walker. I know how this sounds, but I swear it's the truth. The threat is real." The Lord Commander arched a brow. "Indeed? I've heard many improbable things in my time on the wall, but few men speak of meeting the others face to face." He turned to Stark. "Does my Lord Stark vouch for this man's words?" Stark's jaw tightened. "He speaks with sincerity, though I cannot confirm all he claims. That is part of why I've come, to learn whether the Watch has evidence that would support this." Corgyle exhaled, raking a hand across his scalp. "I have not seen any others myself, but the men returning from deep ranging are frightened, my lord. These are not green recruits, they're seasoned watchers. One swears on the gods he saw corpses moving at twilight. Another claims to have heard a voice like cracking ice. Most are too ashamed to speak of such things openly, for fear of ridicule. Still, the shadows in the forest are lengthening, and the wildlings gather in masses, fleeing south. Something is driving them. A chill rippled through the room, separate from the cold air. Eddard Stark's features grew grim. We must see for ourselves if it can be managed. If we can confirm this threat, the North must prepare. Rhaegar swallowed. Lord Commander, do you have any supply of dragonglass weapons? Corgyle's eyes narrowed. A small cache, yes. Mostly arrowheads and a few daggers. Why? In the old stories, Rhaegar replied, choosing his words carefully. Dragonglass and Valyrian steel are said to be weapons against the others. Fire can harm whites. If these tales are not mere myth, we must prepare accordingly. The Lord Commander studied Rhaegar a long moment, then sighed. You speak as though the legends are real, and I cannot say they are not. I will show you what little we have, though if you are proven right, we'll need far more. Stark stepped in. We should arrange a scouting expedition north of the wall. A small party, guided by your best rangers, to see what we can find. I will go as well. If the threat is real, I will witness it and call the banners of the North to arms. The realm must be warned. Corgyle hesitated. My lord, we cannot guarantee your safety beyond the wall. Winter is setting in. The haunted forest is perilous. Wildling raiders, the cold itself, the beasts. Eddard held up a hand. I understand, but I cannot in good conscience return to Winterfell with mere rumors. My duty as Warden of the North compels me to know the truth. A hush followed, broken only by the faint creak of the tower timbers in the chill. Then Corgyle nodded. Very well. I will assemble my finest rangers, men who know the deep wood. We will keep the party small, no more than a dozen. We can provision you with warm clothing, dragonglass arrowheads, and enough supplies for a fortnight. But beyond that, you are at the mercy of the land. Stark agreed. They spoke for another hour about logistics. Rhaegar listened intently, each step of the plan stirring an undercurrent of dread. He recalled too vividly his own solitary journey into those frozen wastes, and the uncanny presence that had nearly stopped his heart. Now, it seemed he would be returning with Stark at his side. Would they find more than they bargained for? Would the others appear to him once again, or reveal themselves to all in some dire display? When they concluded their preparations, Corgyle arranged quarters for Eddard and his men in the common barracks. Rhaegar and his companions were given a cramped cell-like room within the tower itself, presumably so the Lord Commander could keep them close and under watch. As the day wore on, Black Brothers and Stark guards bustled about, gathering gear and packing rations. Outside, the wind picked up, flinging snow against the old walls of Castle Black. Rhaegar stood in the courtyard, watching the swirl of white. A cold flutter of memory washed over him. The visage of that tall, silent figure with eyes like pale fire. He murmured a quiet vow that he would protect what was left of his family from this creeping doom, even if it cost him his life. He might be a prince in name only, an exiled ghost of a fallen dynasty, but he still carried the knowledge of what awaited them if they failed. That night, the wind rose to a gale, rattling shutters and making the watchtowers groan. Ravens in the rookery cawed in agitation. Rhaegar found it difficult to sleep. He rose from his bed and drifted through the drafty corridor, eventually finding himself in a small alcove overlooking the yard. Snow whipped past in sheets, partly obscuring the torches. Somewhere below, he saw Eddard Stark pacing, deep in thought, ignoring the storm. He wore a heavy cloak and seemed lost in contemplation of the wall's imposing face. It struck Rhaegar then how precarious their alliance was. Two men on opposite sides of a bloody history, forced by fate to unite against a threat beyond mortal concerns. If only he had seen this clarity sooner, if only the realm had listened. But regrets were worthless now. The only question was whether they could face what lay beyond, or whether they would be consumed by it. Come morning, the storm had eased. Drifts of fresh snow sparkled in pale daylight. Stark, Rhaegar, and the selected rangers gathered by the gate that led to the icy stairs ascending the wall. Ravens fluttered overhead, their cries echoing. Men wrapped themselves in layered furs, thick gloves, and sturdy boots. Each carried a weapon, and several had dragonglass daggers strapped to their belts or hidden in their packs. They would cross over the wall using the ancient lift and then descend into the lands beyond. The climb was harrowing, as always, wooden platforms swaying against the sheer face of ice hundreds of feet high. The wind snatched at them, and their breath plumed in the freezing air. At the top, the vista was breathtaking. An endless expanse of white and gray, ridges of forest broken by snow-covered hills. Far in the distance, jagged mountains clawed at a pewter sky. The party carefully made their way to the far side, where a wooden walkway led to a sturdy staircase descending the northern face. A sense of crossing into another world settled over them. Rhaegar felt his heart pound harder with each step downward. This was the realm of the others, the deep wilderness where no laws of men held sway. At the base, they assembled. A stern ranger named Kell Blackwood took point. He had spent years patrolling beyond the wall, his bearded face lined by countless harsh winters. He carried a bow with dragonglass-tipped arrows. They set off into the trackless land, following faint game trails. The watchers at Castle Black could do nothing but wait and pray for their safe return. Snow muffled the crunch of their footsteps. Eddard Stark rode at the center of the column, mounted on a hardy northern Garen. Rhaegar rode beside him on another sure-footed beast. The rangers fanned out ahead and behind, scanning the woods. Their breath formed clouds that drifted in the biting air. The trees stood silent and foreboding, skeletal branches clawing at the sky. They pressed on for 2 days, making slow progress. They set up tents in sheltered hollows, building small fires that gave meager warmth. At night, the darkness was impenetrable, the wind chilling them to the bone. Rhaegar lay awake in his tent, hearing the groan of branches and the distant howls of wolves. Every so often, he sensed the hair on his arms prickle, as if something unseen lurked just beyond the firelight. By the middle of the 3rd day, the rangers led them to a site rumored to be an abandoned wildling camp. Broken huts ringed a frozen clearing. The snow drifted waist-high against wooden walls. The place was eerily still. Kell Blackwood dismounted and carefully picked his way inside the largest hut. Rhaegar and Stark followed. The interior was half-collapsed, stinking of damp decay. "Empty," Blackwood muttered, crouching beside a broken stool. No signs of battle. Could be they fled south, or perhaps something else happened. Eddard Stark paced slowly. If they left in haste, they might have left belongings. But the place is stripped bare, aside from broken furniture. Rhaegar looked around, uneasy. "I've seen wildling camps before. They don't usually tidy up so thoroughly. It's as if they vanished." A younger ranger called from outside, "My lord, you'll want to see this." They emerged to find him standing near the edge of the clearing, where trees loomed. He pointed to the snow. There, half-buried, were remnants of footprints. Not human footprints, but large, elongated shapes, as if made by bare feet that ended in something like claws. The tracks curved around the perimeter, then disappeared. Blackwood frowned deeply. "Can't say I've seen anything quite like that." Eddard Stark knelt, brushing snow aside. "It's not a bear. Could it be a shadow cat? The shape is odd." Rhaegar's mouth felt dry. He remembered glimpsing the footprints of whites once, stiff and deliberate, though these seemed bigger. "We should be cautious," he said. Whatever made those tracks could still be near. They scouted the area, finding no fresh signs. The tracks might have been days old. Darkness was falling again, so they decided to camp within the circle of huts, hoping the partial walls would offer some protection from the wind. They built a single large fire in the center of the clearing. The horses were tethered close, huddled in their blankets. The rangers set a perimeter watch. Most tried to get some rest in the huts, but the place felt oppressive. Rhaegar sat near the fire, gazing into the flames. Eddard Stark joined him, knees drawn up against the chill. Neither spoke for a long time. Then, in a low voice, Stark said, "This land is too quiet. Every hair on my neck stands on end." Rhaegar nodded. "They are here somewhere, waiting. The others or their servants. They may sense our presence. The question is whether they'll show themselves." "You speak with certainty," Stark murmured. "Because I remember how it felt," Rhaegar said, swallowing. "As if the cold itself had a will, a hunger." Stark studied him. "If we meet them, we must be ready. The men's resolve will be tested. Not many truly believe in walking dead or worse. We have steel, we have dragonglass, we have fire. Let us pray it's enough." Night closed in, and the forest's hush was absolute. Clouds drifted overhead, occasionally revealing a sliver of moonlight. The rangers walked their patrols. One by one, men dozed off near the fire. Rhaegar found sleep elusive. He tried to rest, leaning against a half-intact hut wall, cloak bundled around him. The flickering firelight played across his closed eyelids, and he slipped into a troubled half-dream, half-vigil. He did not know how much time had passed when he snapped awake, heart pounding. The fire had burned low, embers glowing red beneath the thin layer of ash. The clearing was draped in shadows. A faint moan of wind carried an echo that sounded almost like whispering. Rhaegar slowly rose, scanning the gloom. Most men still slept. He could see the silhouette of 2 watchers near the perimeter. He noticed Eddard Stark, also awake, standing a few yards away with his sword half-drawn, eyes straining at the darkness. A shape flickered at the edge of vision. Rhaegar tensed. Something moved among the trees, pale as a wisp of moonlight. The perimeter guards hadn't sounded an alarm. Perhaps they hadn't spotted it yet. Rhaegar's breath came quickly. He felt an electric current of fear race along his spine. He stepped toward Stark, whispering, "Look there, at the tree lean." Stark's gaze snapped to the spot. His knuckles whitened on his sword hilt. "I see it." Rhaegar dared to call softly to the nearest ranger, "To arms!" Before the ranger could respond, a gust of wind whipped through the camp, sending sparks from the fire swirling skyward. As if conjured by that gust, figures emerged from the darkness. Thin silhouettes with flesh like milk glass, eyes burning with pale blue phosphorescence. The others, at least 3, perhaps more in the shadows behind them. Their movements were unnaturally graceful, soundless. Each carried a weapon seemingly forged from ice that shimmered in the weak moonlight. A strangled cry rose from one of the watchers. Men jolted awake, scrambling for their swords or bows. Panic rippled through them. Eddard Stark drew his sword fully, calling out orders. Rhaegar fumbled for his own blade. He glimpsed Corlys Waters lunging for the stack of dragonglass-dipped spears. The lead other advanced, silent footfalls barely indenting the snow. Stark's men cursed and swung their steel. But as a sword struck the other's icy blade, the steel sheared with a ringing crack that vibrated the air. Shards flew, leaving the man holding half a blade. He recoiled in horror, stumbling back. Rhaegar forced down terror and lunged in to help. He aimed a slash at the other's flank. The creature's speed was inhuman. It twisted aside and brought its frosty sword around in a riposte. Rhaegar barely managed to dodge, feeling the bitter cold radiating from that unnatural weapon. Frost formed along the edges of his cloak where the blade passed. Cries rang out from the other side of the camp. Another waited among the rangers, scattering them like leaves. One man had the presence of mind to light a torch and thrust it forward, causing the other to recoil slightly. Then an arrow streaked by, its tip black glass glinting. It grazed the other's shoulder, making it hiss in a voice like cracking ice. The creature whirled, slashing with its sword, and the bowman went down, blood staining the snow. Eddard Stark attacked from behind, brandishing a torch in his left hand and his steel sword in his right. The flame made the creature snarl and withdraw a step, but it quickly pivoted, batting the torch aside. Stark lunged, steel clanging uselessly against the ice weapon, which did not break under the blow. Another joined the fray, its eyes radiating that eerie blue glow. On the far side, Corlys thrust a dragonglass-tipped spear at one of them. The spear connected with the creature's torso, and for an instant, it let out a piercing shriek. Then its entire form cracked like ice under a hammer. The other collapsed into shards, melting into a fine layer of frost upon the snow. A hush fell around that spot, a stunned sense of hope that they could indeed kill these beings. Rhaegar snatched a dragonglass dagger from the scattered weapons, heart thundering. He felt the old terror swirl inside him, warring with fierce resolve. This was the moment he had dreaded, the confrontation that could decide the realm's fate. Another other advanced toward him, sword raised. Rhaegar circled, stepping carefully on the slippery ground. He feinted with his steel sword, drawing its attention, then lunged with the dragonglass dagger. The creature moved impossibly fast, ice blade whistling down. Rhaegar twisted, blade scraping across his armor with a cold that burned. He felt a streak of agony as the tip gashed his side, but he managed to ram the dagger into the other's chest. There was a terrible, keening shriek. The other's body shuddered, cracks spiraling across its pale flesh. In seconds, it disintegrated, collapsing into shards that glittered momentarily before dissolving into icy vapor. Rhaegar stumbled, pressing a hand to his bleeding side. He grit his teeth against the cold, shouting, "Dragonglass! Use dragonglass!" A third other engaged two of Stark's men near the remains of the fire. One man swung a steel sword which shattered on contact. The other's blade tore him open, the bitter cold radiating as if freezing his blood instantly. The second man thrust a dragonglass-tipped spear in a desperate attempt, but he missed, and the other pivoted with lethal grace, ready to cut him down. Eddard Stark charged in from the side, dragging a dragonglass dagger across the ground where it had fallen. He slammed the dagger into the creature's flank. It hissed, a sound like nails on ice, and reeled backward. Stark drove in again, showing the same iron resolve that had made him a legend among his men. The other's ice sword swept upward, but too late. The dragonglass dagger sank home. With another shriek, the other fractured and dissolved, leaving a swirl of pale mist that scattered on the wind. Panting, Stark and the remaining men looked around. Several bodies lay in the snow, blood glistening black in the moonlight. A handful of men were badly wounded, moaning. The night fell silent, the others gone as swiftly as they'd appeared. Those that survived had melted back into the forest. Rhaegar collapsed to one knee, feeling icy pain radiating from his wound. Stark knelt beside him, breathing hard. "You were right," Stark murmured, voice shaking with adrenaline and horror. "Gods help us. They are real." Rhaegar managed a grim nod, pressing his gloved hand to the wound on his side. "We must warn them all. The realm, everyone." Stark stood, his face white as the snow. He cast his gaze over the fallen men, the broken weapons, the patches of melted frost where the others had died or vanished. At that moment, Rhaegar saw in him a new clarity, a sense of utter determination. The Lord of Winterfell had stared into the face of the ancient enemy, and he would not forget. "Help the wounded," Stark barked to the survivors. "We ride at first light. We must get back to Castle Black, then to Winterfell. We must call the banners. And beyond the north, the realm must know." Rhaegar gritted his teeth against the cold agony. He let one of the rangers pull him to his feet, mind spinning. This was only a small taste of what awaited if the others advanced in full force. But at least they had proof now. Eddard Stark would not be silent. He would bear witness before lords and kings alike. The vow Rhaegar had once made to these inhuman beings might have bought the realm a few years, but it was done now. War, the greatest war in history, loomed on the horizon, and men had precious little time to prepare. If they failed, the long night would fall again. As he staggered to the half-ruined hut where men laid out the wounded, Rhaegar clenched his fists. Blood dripped from the tear in his side, but he focused on the fragile spark of hope that remained. They had found a weapon that could kill the others. Dragonglass. Perhaps Valyrian steel as well. He would see that knowledge spread. For the living to triumph, they would need every advantage. And if the realm cast him out or branded him a traitor again, so be it. He would do all he could to atone for the bargain he once struck, the vow that had postponed doom but had not prevented it. He lay back against the splintered wood, and Stark knelt beside him, helping to press a bandage to the wound. The swirl of snow and the flicker of dying firelight blurred in Rhaegar's vision. Yet through the pain, he felt the faintest stirring of resolve. He would not let the darkness take him, not yet. Whether the realm hailed him as prince or condemned him as a traitor, he had one purpose now, to stand against the coming storm and see that the living did not bow to the horrors that walked in the cold. Outside, the wind moaned like a lament, and the snow carried away the last fragments of shattered ice where the others had stood. But on men's lips, the name of the White Walkers would no longer be a mere fable. Soon all of Westeros would know what they had seen. The time for doubt was over, and the war for the dawn was about to begin.